The Sikh Human Rights Group proudly presents our Environmental and Diversity Speaker Series. Today's topic, addressing climate change through local community engagement and support. Today you'll be listening to Alasdair Roxburgh and Miss Katie Percival from the civil society organisation Friends of the Earth. Recorded live on the 30th of June 2021, this is the fourth podcast in Sikh Human Rights Group's 2021 Environmental and Diversity Speaker Series. Welcome panellists, and thank you very much for joining us today. Mr. Alasdair Roxburgh, could I please ask you to begin by telling our audience a little bit about the work that you are currently doing and have done in the past at Friends of the Earth?
Good morning. So Friends of the Earth in England, Wales and Northern Ireland actually turned 50 this year, and it has a rich history of campaigning on various environmental issues during that time. So stuff around revolved around recycling and deposit return schemes, which it's amazing sometimes how these comes around. It's been very much in the news this last year on that side of stuff. We've been involved in campaigns to prevent deforestation, building driving force behind the world's first Climate Change Act, which we got through the UK Parliament a bit over a decade ago now. And in recent years, have been heavily involved in the anti-fracking movement, along with campaigning to ban certain types of pesticides that damage and harm bees. Globally, we're one of the world's largest environmental movement, with member groups spread all across the world. And we really believe in the power of local community to affect change, and that grassroots action is critical in delivering that around the world.
Thank you very much. That was excellent. Miss Katie Percival, could I also ask you to begin by telling our audience a little bit about the work that you're currently doing and have done in the past at Friends of the Earth? In addition, could I please ask you to tell us a little bit about your extremely interesting and highly commendable independent tree planting initiative?
Yeah, of course. So with Friends of the Earth, I'm someone that cares about the environment. So I went to a couple of Friends of the Earth Manchester meetings, and I did get involved in some of the campaigns, like one of the transport campaigns that we're running in Manchester is called Bike Friday. So the idea of that is to get people to commute by bike rather than car when they're traveling into the city centre for work. So as an avid cyclist myself, I led a group from where I live into the city centre. But to be honest, I feel like we could always be doing more. And I was thinking, I should be doing more, like what can I do? And that's why I started the tree planting, which was really a challenge that I set for myself. Because I was concerned about climate change. I'd even go as far to say I'm quite scared and anxious when I think about climate change. And I study environmental science like as a part-time degree as well. So I know a little bit about how we can effectively mitigate that problem and what we should be doing. And I made some lifestyle changes myself. But then I just asked myself, well, what else can I do? What can I do? What's the most effective thing that I can do as one person to mitigate climate change? And I just kept coming across plant trees. Actually, if anyone listening wants to know more about what an individual can do, there's a really good book, The Future We Choose, it's called, by Christina Figueres and Tom Rivett-Carnick, and there's some really good ideas in there about what you can do to tackle climate change. But that was just one of the places where I heard a good thing you can do is tree planting. Another good resource for me was the Tree Town Guide, which was put together by a different environmental charity called Possible. And that guide was an example of some people in another town who had just decided, we want to plant more trees and we're going to do it. Here's where we want to plant them. We're going to ask the landowner for permission and we're going to just get these trees planted. And I was thinking, that's what I need to do. So that's how I got the idea for the tree planting. And then I found a few sites nearby my house where I thought we could plant the trees. And actually I spent a lot more time getting permission for the planting than the actual planting. Like I found a few different sites. I had to get in touch with my local council who owned the sites. I made a report to send to them talking about why I wanted to plant the trees and the benefits they would have both environmentally and for the community. And I think this really helped my contact at the council to give me that permission to go ahead with the planting. So it took a couple of months to get that permission from the council, but then once they had the permission, I went ahead and sourced my trees. Actually, a shout out to another organisation, which was City of Trees Manchester, and they actually supplied all of the saplings that I planted. At first, I thought I was going to fund this project myself and just buy some young trees, they're called whips, and plant them. But actually, City of Trees gave me them for free, so that was really good. And so tree planting season runs from January to March. So by March this year, I planted 130 of these little whips, which actually is nothing because they won't all survive, but I thought it was a good start. And I want to continue this next year in the next tree planting season and plant more trees, which is why I actually went back to Friends of the Earth and my group in Manchester, told them about the project and said, look, more of you can do this in your little area and we can have lots of mini tree planting projects going on all across Greater Manchester. So I brought it back to Friends of the Earth in the end, really, because I knew the more people I could get involved, the better.
That's brilliant. Thank you very much. Dr. Wright, could you please briefly introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about the work that the Sikh Human Rights Group has done in the past and is currently doing to promote pluralistic views of the environment and diversity?
Okay, thank you, and it's nice to meet you, Alasdair and Katie.
Thank you.
Yeah, the Sikh Human Rights Group, I'm a medical doctor, an otolaryngologist, and I do a lot of human rights work, started in '85. Our focus initially was documentation of human rights violations, particularly in India and then other countries. But later in '98, we started working in the environmental field, participated in the World Conference on Sustainable Development in Johannesburg, and increased our interest in this. We, as an organization, we generate ideas and coordinate work, and a lot of the work, field work, is done by organizations who are affiliated to us. One of the things that struck me both in Johannesburg and then subsequently there were some conferences in UNESCO at Bangkok, was while European society, Western society is engaged with the climate issues, with environmental issues, there is very little engagement within civil society in many other parts of the world. There is an elite which is engaged, but not the rest of the society. And this discrepancy struck us that perhaps the problem may not be with the societies themselves, but it may be the way the whole the climate field, both at the UN and the international world, is approaching the climate issue through just one civilization and one lens, and not looking at how other civilizations and societies can be more engaged and ownership of their climate and ownership of the environment. Our position is that the environment is not a new problem. It's been there for centuries, and every society and every civilization and every belief system as well have concepts on the relationship of a human being with the environment, with the cosmos, with everything around us, and with other people and species. So how come they seem not to be engaged? And what has happened? The focus of quite a lot of civil society organizations is on the state, against the state, and particularly in the non-Western countries, it's blaming the state or asking the state to change. But I think we need to energize and try and get the civil society, energize civil society, and get them more engaged in their own countries, in their own fields around them. I think that may be one of the ways of going forward. This is our perspective. So we have big affiliates in Punjab. They have planted something like 700,000 trees, and they've done a lot of work in the environmental field. We have in South Africa, we have some in Brazil, we have in America, there is a online university set up by one of our board members who brings in a lot of ethics on environment and practical field work in Southeast Asia and countries around there. So that's how we work. But we are a small organization, overreach ourselves sometimes.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much, panelists. We're going to begin today's discussion by delving into a variety of prominent environmental questions. I'm then going to give the floor to my colleague, Ms. Bethan Walters, who will ask you a few questions on diversity and inclusion related matters. So panelists, to begin, in your expert opinions, why are local communities and civil society organisations, such as yours, so vital to protecting our future biodiversity? And Mr. Roxburgh, if I could please ask you to go first, that'd be wonderful.
So I think from my point of view and from Friends of the Earth point of view, it's less about the organisation, it's about the communities we work with, the local groups that we work with, and the role they play in tackling environmental issues. I think too easily and too often it can end up in a conversation about who are those people in, say, Westminster and Houses of Parliament, when actually the real change needs to be driven from and come from local communities. I think that's really for three key reasons. First of all, they have the power to make that change happen. They have a voice, they have a vote, they have the ability to reach others in their community, to bring people together, to unite people behind key issues, and to actually make change happen, wherever that may be, whether that's tree planting, whether that's lobbying their local councillors on certain issues as well. Secondly, like the crises we face today, the climate and ecological crises, these are big global crises, but they have local solutions. And those local solutions can only be delivered by local communities and local groups. I think thirdly, and perhaps most crucially as well, local community groups have the ability to connect with others in their community, those who perhaps don't always have their voice heard as much, and be able to amplify the voices that are less heard of. I think the role of an organisation like Friends of the Earth is to do our best to help support those communities, whether that be through providing resources or guides, or whether that be through connecting them with other communities who are facing similar challenges or tackling similar issues as well. I think through that sort of activity, we can really substantially shift like things far more broadly than just sort of speaking to one MP or one government minister in Westminster. Friends of the Earth in England, Wales and Northern Ireland has over 300 community groups that it supports, and we're really proud of that and proud of the work they do and what our job is to support them and help them deliver the changes that are needed at that local level.
Thank you very much. Ms. Percival, could I put the same question to you, please?
Well, I mean, I think Alasdair's made some really great points. It's difficult for me to not repeat what he said there, but for me, I'd say for NGOs and civil society groups, they're important in three ways. Firstly, that there's groups that directly carry out conservation work, such as Woodland Trust or City of Trees, who I mentioned earlier. I don't know actually how the work of groups like these compares to like conservation work carried out by the government. I don't know what proportion it is, but definitely there's groups like Lancashire Wildlife Trust or the Wildlife Trust is another one that do a lot of conservation work that wouldn't get done if these NGOs didn't exist. And then of course there's another role of NGOs like Friends of the Earth who run community groups, and they encourage people, they're raising awareness really of environmental issues with everyone. And again, I'm not sure that if those NGOs weren't there, would people be aware of the problem of the biodiversity crisis and climate change? I think if it was left to the state and private businesses, the general public wouldn't be aware of these issues. And then, like Alasdair said as well, there's the role of empowering communities to take direct action themselves, even things like litter picking and tree planting, like these grassroots activities, really help people get involved in conservation who perhaps wouldn't otherwise. And then this, the third role that I think NGOs can play in fighting the biodiversity crisis is the lobbying the government. Like Alasdair said, sometimes you can get help from Friends of the Earth to do something like write to your local MP, because our government does do what it does. They do work for us, like our MPs work for us. So if we can lobby our government, write to our MPs, and be politically active, we can help change policy on the environment, and NGOs really enable the public to do so.
That's excellent. Thank you so much. Dr. Wright, can I put the same question to you?
Yeah, yes, I mean, the thing is that the governments can pass all the laws and all the policies they want. If people are not engaged in it, they won't succeed. Okay. Secondly, if there isn't pressure from the people and civil society, then governments are very much at the mercy of big business and transnationals who have their own interests. I mean, we, you know, there are, you hear of billionaires are building bunkers to survive a climate catastrophe or things like that. But those luxuries are not available to the rest of us. So billionaires might think, well, the climate crisis may not be that important for them, but it is very important for us, who we don't have the luxury of that sort of thing. And with oceans rising, the climate getting hotter, there are many parts of the world which are going to be inhabitable if we don't take steps now. And those steps can't be taken just by government, they have to be taken by civil society. And then what the challenge as we see in our organization is, how do you encourage civil society? How do you make civil society take ownership of this issue and not just leave it to the government? If you look at the coming COP26, there's a lot of focus on what governments must do. There doesn't seem to be a focus on what civil society should do. And if you look in this country as well, I don't know what your experience is, but as I see it, ethnic communities are not, I mean, they may be engaged individually with the number of environmental organizations, including yours, but they're not engaged as communities in this field. One of the differences between ethnic communities and other communities is that ethnic communities often tend to work collectively in their own community, and this was appreciated by the British government after the Northern Riots in 2001, and it's often appreciated by politicians when they are going for votes. And maybe the way to engage ethnic communities in this country, for instance, on the climate field, is slightly different than engaging the average the white community in this country. Okay? Maybe we need to work through either the religious organizations or community organizations, and when a couple of leaders take steps, then it cascades throughout the community. Others start taking interest as well. Whereas in the general community, it's very much an individual is convinced that they have to take steps and they become engaged in this. I think that we see that not only globally that we have to be more pluralistic in our approach and engagement, but maybe we could start in this country as well. It's something I've not been able to successfully convince the department's concern, but let's hope this is something that we can work together on this. How do we work? I mean, it seems to be, for instance, in the recent COVID crisis, there was a problem with ethnic communities not taking up the vaccination. But once they started working through the community leaders and the communities, they suddenly found the same institutions were opening up and letting the vaccination centers be to come into their say gurdwaras or mosques and mandars, etc. And then the whole community was getting vaccinated. So there are different dynamics in the way different communities work. But in the end, yeah, if individuals and communities are not interested in the climate issue, all the laws and the policies are not going to work.
Thank you very much, Dr. Wright. So our next question today, panelists, is: do you agree or disagree that non-governmental environmental protection movements have historically been ignored by state-supported large environmental campaigns and agencies, Western science and state governments, but this is now starting to change? And Mr. Roxburgh, if I could ask you to go first, please.
I'm not sure if I could give an absolute answer of agree or disagree on that. I think there's clearly been cases where that has happened, and that's not a good thing. It clearly isn't a good thing. But I think there's been a tide change really in recent years. I think over the last 4 or 5 years or so, the whole environmental movement is kind of no longer having to almost justify itself, particularly on issues like the climate crisis. And for a long time, there was arguments over, is climate change a thing or not? I think that argument's clearly been won and been accepted by the vast majority now as well. I think also what we've seen in recent years, which has been quite encouraging, is NGOs working far more with social movements, with community groups, working with scientists and academics to really challenge and hold to account particularly governments around their inaction. Now, this differs in different places around the world, and there's clearly places where there's been a real lack of inaction and that some large NGOs at times have ignored social movements far too much. But I know certainly from Friends of the Earth's experience of working with community groups up and down the country, one of the things we're increasingly doing is taking the insight we're hearing from those community groups and trying to make sure that insight and those experiences are shared to politicians, but ideally making sure those community groups and their voices are the ones being heard by politicians rather than our own as well. I think that's really crucial for building a movement that's really sustainable, that's really impactful, and that's really genuine and rooted in people's everyday experiences in their communities, their experiences of poor environment, of air pollution, of environmental degradation and so forth. I think that's shifting, and it has to continue to shift because there's a huge amount we have to do in the coming years to tackle the climate crisis and the biodiversity crisis. And the only way we're going to do it is if large civil society organizations, small ones, social movements, small community groups, scientists, wider academic community work together to tackle these crises, and crucially to put pressure on politicians to address them as well.
Thank you very much. That was extremely insightful. Ms. Percival, could I put the same question to you, please?
Yes, of course. So do I agree that environmental organisations have historically been ignored? I have to disagree up to a point, because I think there are good examples of where environmental campaigning has resulted in a change to policy. You just look on the Friends of the Earth website. I think it talks about the recycling campaign and how there was no recycling across our country until campaigns like Friends of the Earth's brought attention to that issue. Or even more recently, the plastic bag charge, that was a result of campaigns by various environmental groups. But do I think that environmental groups are, I think that there's a call to action from environmental protection groups at the moment, and I think stronger action needs to be taken by governments. I think like Alasdair rightly said, now that it's accepted that climate change is happening, there's no argument there, and the evidence that the environmental destruction is such a threat to human life builds up. Our politicians in England, I can't really speak for the world over, politicians have felt compelled to make statements and set targets, and that's what we're seeing at the moment. But in my opinion, this call to action from environmental protection groups is still somewhat being ignored, because if we were really taking the science seriously, in my opinion, stronger action would be taken. And yet our government is still umming and ahhing over whether or not to open a new coal mine. So I think if they were really listening to NGOs and not ignoring them, there'd be no question of this happening.
Thank you very much. That was excellent. Dr. Rai, could I ask you the same question?
Yeah, I think for a long time, governments have ignored the environmental issue and environmental NGOs, but over the last 10 years, it is becoming obvious to governments that people are concerned, and there are no votes in ignoring it. Okay. There was too much emphasis on the economy and industrialization and that sort of thing. So there are governments are realizing, particularly in democratic countries, that this is serious and people are concerned. But as you rightly pointed out, there are many areas where government just tends to ignore it, takes a sort of a risk approach where it thinks, well, we can get away with this. And there are pressures from big multinational corporations for investments and things like that, which are attractive to governments. It's an easy sort of option for government to offer jobs, etc., but without looking at the long-term consequences. I think at the international level, again, the concentration, maybe that's what the news tends to pick up. Maybe we don't always see behind the news. It's about governments, and governments deciding this, governments deciding that. But what about civil society? Where are the movements, and why are they not in the news, and why their views are not there in the mainstream media? Their concerns are not there. Yeah, I think the focus needs to be balanced a bit more, and more NGOs need to be listened to, or at least be connected with the government policies in this field. And I think Britain could become a model for other countries as well, where civil society engagement in policies, particularly to do with the environment, could be replicated in other countries. I know in many countries, in even democratic countries around the world, civil society organizations are seen to be a nuisance rather than complementary to state building or nation building. I think there needs to be more push on that. We'll see what COP26 produces, whether there is a genuine respect for civil society or whether it's just a showcase, which is often the trend at UN and many of the international institutions. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rai. You mentioned COP26, which leads me quite nicely onto my next question, which is, what are the greatest challenges that our global community faces when it comes to combating and redressing climate change and/or achieving the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals by 2030, and how can they be overcome? For example, what should ordinary or non-expert members of our global society do when they think newly enacted environmental policies or laws are unethical or unjust? And Mr. Roxburgh, as always, could I ask you to go first?
The greatest challenge we face really is political inaction, the risk that essentially politicians and those in power at all levels of power do nothing to tackle the crisis. And the best way we can address that is by using the power we all have as citizens. That means coming together, working with each other, campaigning for change, challenging our politicians, pushing them to change laws, to change policies, to help tackle the climate crisis. But it's going to be tough. Let's make no bones about it. It's going to be really tough to be able to do that. But the reality is we're a global community, and when we work together, when we work in partnership together, well, we can achieve great things. I think the only way we'll overcome that political inertia, that political sort of inaction, is by campaigning, by advocating to decision makers for different policies and different laws.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Ms. Percival, could I ask you to go next, please?
Yeah. I really like Alasdair's answer that political action and campaigning is something that anyone can do to influence the government, because yeah, we do need to just influence the government, and their inaction on environmental issues is a big threat. But I personally, I find myself questioning, is this working? Are they listening? Like, it's like our last question. We think the government actually ignore NGOs, but what else can you do? I think a really big challenge to addressing climate change and achieving those sustainable development goals that you mentioned in your question is that in order to live in a way where we can meet those development goals, everyone like in the Western world needs to drastically change their lifestyle. And behavior change is so hard, like it's hard for an individual and it's hard on a society scale. But if an ordinary or non-expert member of society wants to address the problems that they see, my advice was you can just live in what you think is a more sustainable way. But this is really, really hard because it means you're going against the way you brought up and the way you've always lived and the lifestyle that everyone lives around you. For example, like, can you tell your friends that you don't want to travel by plane when you go on holiday? This is a really hard thing to do, but if you do say that, maybe you start a conversation and you get more and more people thinking about, actually, air travel is bad for the environment. You're raising awareness of the issue, and hopefully by raising awareness across ordinary people, that would prompt us all to vote in such a way, or that would make our politicians see that what we need is action to address these key issues on the environment. I think there's lots of different lifestyle changes that an individual can make, and the more people live in a more sustainable way and talk about how we can live more sustainably, that will hopefully prompt politicians to make the right decisions. And maybe that's where the role of NGO is. It's between people showing that they care by living in a sustainable way and politicians who have the power to make those bigger changes. Sorry if that answer was a bit wordy.
No, not at all. That was excellent. Thank you very much. I particularly like the air travel analogy. I think everyone can relate to that. So that was excellent. Thank you. Dr. Rai, excuse me.
Yeah, I think question basically again comes to how do you make civil society take ownership of this rather than just leaving it to governments. I think we have a couple of not problems, but dimensions or difficulties in this whole field is that human society has put a lot of trust in science to solve our problems. And at the back of people's mind, there is also this thinking that, yeah, we're facing a crisis now, but I'm sure the people in white coats will find a solution, say, in 5 years or 10 years to our problems. Yeah? And they keep on going regardless, and governments go on regardless. And that has been one of a dangerous philosophical shift, in my opinion, in human society, that there is a limit to where how much science can solve and how much development can resolve. And there is a point at which society has to understand and take ownership of these things. So take some other examples. Let's say we've quoted this in the past. A Hindu will not eat beef. It doesn't matter. You can make all the economic sense to them. that you know, the food crisis in India could be solved if you started eating beef, but they won't eat beef. Okay, and government policies, whether in India or in this country, have to adapt to them. A Muslim will not eat pork and will not eat non-halal meat. Again, government policies have to adapt to that. The environment, it doesn't seem to have that sort of a passionate ownership by people. It's too much a rationalist discourse trying to explain to people your future is at stake. You know, there isn't that connection with the environment. There isn't that resistance by people that we don't really want any more gas guzzling planes and things like that, or projects, etc. And I think it's the challenge for NGOs is not just the government policies, but also how do we make people more conscious of this and understand that the people in white coats are not going to be able to solve this problem in the future. It is something that we have to solve ourselves.
Thank you very much, Dr. Wright, and thank you very much, panelists, for your extremely insightful and thought-provoking answers. I'm now going to give the floor to my colleague, Ms. Bethan Walters, who's going to ask you a few questions on diversity and inclusion-related matters.
Thank you, Carlos. Hi. So yeah, I'm just going to ask questions. Yeah, like Carlos said, talking about the environment, but how then diversity comes into it as well. So the first question is, so could you please explain why looking at environmental issues from a Western-only perspective is not only counterproductive, especially when it comes to tackling the many global issues surrounding climate change, but why the colonial mentality can also be a bar to tackling the many issues surrounding diversity and inclusion? So we'll start with Ms. Percival, if you would like.
Yeah, sure. You asked a lot of things in your question, but first of all, if we're looking at environmental problems, why is it bad to have a Western viewpoint? Well, I'd say because in the Western world and increasingly in what we call the developing world, we judge the success of our society based on economic growth. We measure them by gross domestic product. But really, if we continue to do that and we say that the only way to measure success is GDP, then we're just going to burn through the world's resources and create pollution. And we're also going to force people into an unsatisfying lifestyle, really, where at an individual level, you judge your value from how much stuff you buy and how much luxury food you eat and you waste and how many holidays you go on. That's what the Western world has become. Is that where we want developing countries to go? Well, no, it's not. So we can't use, I don't want to say more developed countries, but we can't use the Western world like UK and USA as a model for the developing world to aspire to, because that will result in environmental destruction.
Yeah, definitely. It can't be one rule for one and one rule for another. Mr. Roxburgh, would you like to contribute?
Yeah, I'll echo a lot of what Katie said in her answer as well. I mean, look, the Industrial Revolution, the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution was the UK driving force behind emissions. Historically, we are a huge contributor to emissions, and we've done we're one of the leading countries historically in terms of emission levels. Whilst the countries who are suffering worst and most already from climate change are ones in the developing world. Now, we need to recognise that difference in our response to these crises. We need to recognise that historic responsibility and support developing nations as they face the first and worst impact of the climate crisis as well. And as Katie says, we need to not be as economic driven and focused solely on economic drivers of growth, of expansion. They're fueling the climate crisis and fueling us to be sort of obsessed with burning carbon, whether that be petrol in our cars or jet fuel on planes, whatever that might be. And there needs to be a change there. the West has been responsible for the majority of emissions, and we need to recognise that, and we need to support countries who are facing the worst consequences of that. That needs to be a priority.
Thank you. No, that was really well put. Dr. Rai, would you like to contribute?
Yeah, I think I think we need to have a more pluralistic approach. I think there is we don't need to be critical about Western society. It's the way it operates. It's the way it functions. But what I feel is a problem with the international institutions like the UN or even the climate movement internationally, is that there is still this mentality of perhaps unconsciously or consciously of hegemony, that these are the problems the way we see it, and this is the problem, these are the solutions the way we see it, and without understanding that maybe other people don't see the problems in the same way or the solutions in the same way. And this became quite obvious to me when the UN was trying to set up a universal ethics of environment. This is where we got involved in Bangkok on that. And I said, look, to me, anything universal smacks of where the church stopped. The United Nations has taken over in trying to discover what is universal values and ethics. Different civilizations have different approaches to many things. And the example I gave was that in Western society, the idea of a finite world, the end looming near, it makes sense to a lot of people, and they will take action. So if we say the world will end in 30 years if we don't take action, a lot of Western society will understand and take action. Now, you go to the average Indian who's not gone to university and not been exposed to Western society, and you tell them the world is going to end in 30 years and we must take action. His culture and belief system tell him that our souls transmigrate. And in Indian civilization, we always believe there are many universes. Okay, it's not something that science has told us, it's been there. And so the person will say, well, so what? My soul will go to another universe, right? And then you tell them that, and then they will say, if it's the karma of the world to end in 30 years, what is it I can do? There's not, there's nothing I can do. Now, if you look at the language of most of the treaties and the conventions at the UN, they are talking to one civilization. They're not talking to this nearly 20% or 15% of the world population, who is also engaged in environmental destruction. And how do you engage them into environmental activism? How do you tell the average Indian or the average Chinese or the average African who has a concept of Ubuntuism why the environment is important to them? And we found that there were very successful projects in North India where, as I was saying, one of the I affiliates have planted something like 700,000 trees without telling farmers or without telling civil society the world is going to end, it's your responsibility. But they use belief systems, traditional belief systems, why they should connect to nature, and why they should have a tree to connect to it, and why it's their sort of or it's a dharmic duty or their spiritual duty to have trees and shrubs around them. And he's been very successful in that's a very different language. And we don't see that in the international forums. We don't see that in government policies. I think it's not so much that Western thinking is wrong. It's that when you universalize one form of thinking and think that is the solution and the way the rest of the world thinks, that I think is where we make an error. And we need to start thinking more pluralistically how we make the rest of the world take ownership of the environment as well.
Thank you. No, that was really well put by all of you. The next question is, do you agree or disagree that the state governments and large environmental organisations and agencies need to start focusing their attention on ensuring that all members of the global society feel engaged with environmental issues and are taught about environmental issues through the gaze of different cultures, outlooks, festivals, religions, and historical traditions from an early age? Ms. Percival, would you like to start?
Of course, I have to agree. Who would disagree with that? I definitely think it's important that we engage all types of people in teaching all types of people about environmental issues. Actually, there's a charity in the UK that's focused on getting more environmental education into our schools. I think that's a really good cause, but why not expand that worldwide? Like, we need to, like you say in your question, we need to engage members of our global society in environmental issues. I think Dr. Rai already gave some good examples in his answer to the last question, actually, of how that might be achieved. International aid isn't something that I know much about, but I think if we help developing countries by providing technology to help them, or access to water and basic needs, maybe we should also helping them to take care of the natural environment.
Great, thank you. And Mr. Roxburgh?
Yeah, I mean, I fully agree with this. I think it's crucial that, like, globally, that everyone at every part of society, every culture understands the climate and the ecological crisis that we're facing together. And I think that's imperative for all of us as individuals, as well as NGOs, as well as governments and others to do it. I think it's crucial that young people are taught about these crises, about what they can do and choose to do in their own lives through their individual action, but also an understanding of why this crisis has emerged, why so many systems have failed or led to this crisis as well, and learn about how we can build a better, fairer world, one which addresses the climate crisis and gives fair opportunities for all. So yeah, I fully agree with that.
Great. And Dr. Wright?
Yeah, I think NGOs need to work together on again, I say not just empowering civil society, but energizing civil society and making it more engaged and take ownership of this. I mean, look at, for instance, us, we wear a turban, the Sikhs wear a turban. The whole the law and the country's policies had to change around us. Not we change for the country, not we change for the law in this country. I mean, we went through disputes in the 60s and 70s, and it had to be accommodated. And if society has the same sort of passion about environment, government policies will change, and that's the challenge, I think, is say for NGOs, international organizations, that it's not just the government, but how do we make civil society become passionate about the environment a bit more than it is, and then that different cultures may have very different ways of engaging it in, and I think that we could easily take it up in Britain. As I said, there are many ethnic communities, there are communities from all over the world in this country. How do we get them to be more activist in this, more demanding of changes in government policy? And I think we could get on to a winner with that. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I'll now pass on to Carlos for one final question, but thank you very much for those.
Yes, thank you very much. That was extremely interesting. I only have one final question, and that is just to conclude. In your opinion, is there one small thing that we could all do to help mitigate and adapt to the negative impacts of climate change? And Mr. Roxburgh, if you wouldn't mind going first.
One small thing we can do So I would probably, perhaps unsurprisingly, encourage everyone to look locally, find a local group that's involved in tackling the climate crisis, join that group and join with others who are probably thinking the same as you are, very similar to as you are, and look at how together we can tackle the crisis.
Excellent, thank you very much. Ms. Percival, can I ask you the same question?
It's hard for me to pick one thing, but if I have to pick one, buy less stuff.
Excellent, thank you very much. Dr. Rai, same question to you.
I think the message I would like to get across to the world is that science is not necessarily going to solve our problem. We have to solve it ourselves.
Brilliant. So thank you very much, panelists, for taking the time out of what I'm sure is very busy schedules to be with us today. Just to conclude, this podcast has been brought to you by the Sikh Human Rights Group. For more information about Friends of the Earth and the Sikh Human Rights Group's environmental and diversity policies, please visit our website, the link to which can be found within the description to this video. Or alternatively, please visit our Instagram account at SHRG_net. I have been Arbuthnott. Thank you very much for listening.